Well, thank you very much, Craig, for that kind introduction, and thank you all. I'm, very honored when I got the Templeton grant. I'm almost a year ago today, and very excited about this project. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about tribal economies and how hopefully with this grant we can make some impact in Indian country. So general outline of the presentation. Did it go? Okay, cool. It worked. Okay, nice. Provide a little background data on tribal economies today. Then I'll talk about historic tribal economies a little bit. Then I'll talk about some of the obstacles to doing business in Indian country today. And then I'll discuss how the grant, the Indian Country Private Sector Project, can make a difference. So the data. Tribal economies are not doing so hot, despite the stereotype of all the tribes being rich from casinos. Definitely not true, unfortunately. Indians have the highest poverty rate in the U.S., about 26% versus about 14% for the U.S. average. And the poverty number for Indian country, and I guess all data in general, is tricky because everybody with high cheekbones says they're Indian, so self-identified, so the numbers are all a little skewed. But if you actually look at the on-reservation poverty numbers, they're actually a lot higher, probably about 35 to 40%. So that includes Indians who live on and off res, is 26%. So it's pretty grim. And this number right there, although Indians are about 1% of the U.S. population, 8 of the 10 poorest counties in the U.S. are majority American Indian. So that's pretty stark. And the average reservation unemployment rate's about 50%, this according to the Senate. And that was prior to COVID-19. And you can imagine, things haven't gotten better since then. So not so great. And on the COVID front too, 2016 House of Representatives report found that about 48% of houses in Indian country do not have access to safe drinking water and garbage disposal facilities. And 1/3 of the houses in Indian country are overcrowded. So you wonder why COVID's so bad on the reservation. You don't have safe water and this houses are overcrowded. So that's all contributes or a function of poverty. And this was not always the case in Indian country, although we often think of, prior to 1492, Christopher Columbus's arrival, Indians were just wandering around, chasing buffaloes, picking berries, and that was life. It was a lot more complicated than that. In fact, many, perhaps most tribes were actually agricultural. And they all had sophisticated governments and rules. Like one of the most persistent myths is tribes didn't have property rights. That's just categorically not true. So like farming tribes, for example, all recognized individual rights in land. I mean, you're not going to go plant crops and somebody else can go, pick your corn and squash. So you had to recognize individual rights in land of some type, often usufructs. And all of an individual Indian's personal property would have been owned, like weapons, jewelry, things like that. Tribes also recognized intellectual property rights. So, for example, songs, stories, things like that. If you created it, it was yours. There's actually an account, I forget which tribe it was, but a son singing the song and the mother gets mad. I wrote that song. You owe me royalties. I took the time and effort to create it. You can't be stealing my stuff. And some tribes, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, recognized property rights in the Pacific Ocean and fishing sites. That's something libertarians are still trying to figure out how to do. But, tribes were doing that centuries ago. And because tribes had property rights, they had things to trade. And if you're going to do exchanges with people you don't know, you have to have contracts, and tribes all had contract laws. Now, one example would be, you guys have heard of the Peace Piper Calumet ceremony. So, we often see it in cartoonish perspective, but these were pre-literate people. So you basically, by doing a ceremony, you created a moment so you could remember the transaction. And once you did the ceremony, now you could trust the people and you can trade. So there were things like that. Now, fictive kinship, you'd become somebody's brother or sister metaphorically, and now you can exchange with them. And I guess on the property too, another thing that just popped in my head. So on Lewis and Clark's journey across, going out west to the Northwest Passage, they stopped in a Mandan village and they wanted to buy corn. So they went up to the men in the village like, hey, want to buy your corn? The men's like, nope, that's not ours. That's the women's. They planted it. That's theirs. Go negotiate with them, because they recognized, it was their property. And tribes had currency too. So in the New England area, you guys all have heard of wampum, I'm sure. You would exchange that. There was a uniform system of measure. In fact, wampum was actually used in the colonies as a currency. You could pay taxes in Massachusetts with wampum and tuition at Harvard with wampum through about the year 1700. And in the Northwest, you had intellium shells were another one. So basically, individual Indians would use those like literally a uniform system of measure. So Indian men would literally tattoo their arms to mark the length of the intellium, so you could measure the length of the shell to determine how much you're paying for a thing. So another example would be elk teeth threshed on the Great Plains. So elk teeth, the two front incisors don't rot. So every time you kill an elk, you keep the teeth and you stack them on the dress, and you can show off your wife, your daughter, how rich you are by how many elk teeth you got on your dress. So they had things like that. Also security devices. If you want to borrow my bow, sure, you can do it, but you got to leave me 3 blankets in case you break it or something like that. So they understood how things like that worked. And they also had tort law. So there's some interesting accounts. So like if you individually owned your land and you visited somebody else's land, you slipped and fall, you could sue them. Very much like a modern day slip and fall. You would hire 2 or 3 people to represent you. They get 2 or 3 people to represent them, and they'd work it out. Whatever they reached, that was the settlement of the case. So very much like a contemporary arbitration. So tribes understood the rule of law. And since they had the rule of law, they were able to develop sophisticated societies. And, many, perhaps most North American civilizations would have been pretty small, but most people today live in relatively small towns too. And one of the things is some tribes, or most tribes, lived in permanent or semi-permanent towns. So semi-permanent, what that means is, like the deer are going to be, 3 miles north, let's go live where the deer are right now. Then whenever the berries bloom, let's move a little farther south to go meet them. And, that's not exactly nomadic. You're moving to take advantage of seasonal events. A present day example would be I went to University of Arizona for law school. I get there in July, and it's pretty nice. Nobody's in town. I like it. No traffic. Come December, it starts getting a little busy because all New England folks are coming down to get out the winter. Are those wandering nomads? No, they're just taking advantage of seasonal events. Indian tribes did the same thing. And there were some big cities too. So Cahokia is probably the best known example. It's located near present-day St. Louis, and it would have been one of the biggest cities in the world during its heyday. It was bigger than London and Paris from about 1000 to 1300. And they built structures larger than the Egyptian pyramids, actually. So it would have taken significant social cohesion to pull off a construction feat like that. You can't be building pyramids and hunting to sustain yourself at the same time. So they understood the division of labor. And of course, if you have thousands of people living together, you're going to have conflicts. So you need to have systems to keep that in place. And the coolest thing about Cahokia, in my opinion, is genetic evidence shows that approximately 1/3 of the people actually immigrated there from west of the Rocky Mountains, south along the now known as Gulf of America, and north of the Great Lakes. So people were actively migrating there. And keep in mind, there's no horses, there's no cars, so you got to walk. So if you're coming from west of Colorado, you got to walk over the Rocky Mountains to get to Cahokia. So people are making a great effort to get to the city. And there's no printing presses either to hear about it. So, just think about how the information was spread. Another cool example, too, is Chaco Canyon, located in present-day northwestern New Mexico. The world's largest apartment building was actually there until the New Yorkers built a larger one in 1882. Chaco Canyon has over 700 rooms in one of the buildings. That's something that's left out of the history books. And one of the cool things about that, too, is there's no timber source within 50 miles. So Indians were carrying timber 50 miles. There's no rivers, no anything to build the site there, which begs the question, why were people so sophisticated carrying timber 50 miles to build something? Nobody knows, but I think it's pretty cool. And there's lots of other examples, too, like Moundville in Alabama, Astalon in Wisconsin, Spiro in Oklahoma, and several others. And because tribes had the rule of law and people were moving around the country, tribes had international trade. So quinoa grown in Tennessee, genetic evidence shows grown in Tennessee makes its way up to Ontario, Canada, over 1,000 years ago. A copper from Lake Superior is all the way down in Tampa, Florida. Sharks from the Pacific Ocean make it to Cahokia. So that means somebody catches the shark in Santa Monica, guts it, carries it across the Rocky Mountains, and then gets it to Cahokia. Cocoa beans from Central America make it to New Mexico. That's why it's called Chaco Canyon, because chocolate from South America is found at Chaco Canyon, as well as macaw feathers and other things. The Intellium shells that I mentioned earlier make their way all along the Pacific coast. And whenever the Jesuits arrived at the Great Lakes, they actually used the Hurons as messengers because they traveled so much faster in their canoes, they would routinely make 1,000-mile trips to trade. So they were much faster than the Jesuits, so the Jesuits paid them to do that. And international exchange was so common that tribes developed trade languages. So if you were in the Southeast, where I'm from, you would have spoken Mobilian, and you could have traded with anybody who spoke Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, or anywhere basically from East Texas to North Carolina. And in the Northwest, it was a Chinook. So basically from Northern California up to Alaska, you could have got around by just speaking Chinook. And cultural evolution, that's a big thing that comes up in tribal economic development. People are like, well, Indians, they just did this, they can't do this stuff, it's not part of their culture. Well, like, what about horses? There were no horses in America when Columbus arrived. In fact, Indians didn't get horses till after the Pueblo Revolt in the 1680s. Nonetheless, once they got the horses, they became quite good with them. According to the U.S. military, they were the best horsemen to ever live. And think about that. Europeans had horses for thousands of years. Indians had it less than 150 years, and they completely transformed their cultures. That's one of the reasons so many tribes on the Great Plains became nomadic. It's a lot easier to hunt buffalo on horseback than it is barefoot. So that's cultural evolution. And you guys must push back and say, Adam, we've seen Avatar. We know Indians are magical and connected to nature, so it makes sense that they would be good with horses. But what about guns? How do you answer that one? So the Europeans are writing that the Indians are better with firearms than the Christians are in the 1610s. It was a crime in all the colonies to sell a gun to the Indians because they were better marksmen. In fact, the tribes thoroughly incorporated them into their cultures. They're actually using them to worship their deities in the 1640s, something the NRA should be stoked about, but they haven't come down to the res yet. So they're thoroughly incorporated in tribal cultures. And Europeans actually describe Indians as, quote, gun connoisseurs. So the British shipped a couple hundred guns to the Iroquois, and the Iroquois said, nope, we don't like them. Send them back. And the British expedited a shipment because they wanted the Iroquois alliance. And one of the cool things, too, is by the 1650s, European gun makers are making guns specifically for Indians. Why might they make guns specifically for Indians? You guys have all seen old movies like The Patriots. How do Europeans fight in the 16 and 1700s? All right, line up. And you do this till everybody dies. Indians said, this is stupid. We do not want to stand still and be shot. There's actually written accounts of this. So by 1650s, the Europeans are making guns about half the length and half the weight, so Indians can run around and not be shot. So next time you're in a gunfight, thank the Indians for your ability to move. And one of the reasons this development transpired is they had different thoughts on warfare. Europeans measured victory by how many of the enemy you killed. Indians measured it by how many you lost. So different incentives at battle. And again, they're so thoroughly enmeshed in cultures that tribes on the Great Lakes are writing, if our young people can't get guns, we're going to starve. We don't know how to hunt with bows anymore. Like, why would you hunt with a bow when you can hunt with a gun? It's a lot more effective. So it's kind of like me, you know, I have the ability probably to figure out how to get to work without my GPS, but why would I? You know, I can just look it up. And tribal laws adapt to these new demands. So the furs are the big things that Europeans want, and Indians want guns, metal tools, cloth, clothing. So the market develops for that. And you actually get specific economies. You guys have all heard of the buck, and that was because that was actually a unit of exchange. 15 deer skins would get you a musket. So uniform systems measured developed. And furs start getting depleted because Indians want the furs because that's their currency. And beaver didn't have much use for tribes until Europeans arrived. So beavers start getting depleted, so tribes develop property rights regimes in beaver territories. Like only this family can hunt in this particular area to stop the depletion of beaver. So tribes did that on their own without anybody coming in and tell them to do it. So they just figured it out. And tribes responded to market incentives. So whenever prices for beavers go up, Indians killed a lot more furs. When they were down, they didn't hunt as much. Likewise, when the Europeans were hungry for food, Indians jacked up prices. So they just responded to the same incentives as everybody else. And there's a really cool account in Native Nations about the Dutch in New York. They were complaining because the Indians would spend more on cakes and cookies, so the Europeans couldn't afford them anymore. So they were driving up the price. So tribes figured it out a long time ago, but unfortunately, and we have a relatively short time, so can't go through all the history. If you want to read a great rendition of it, you can check out my new book. But anyway. So the federal government's complicated a lot of things over time, and tribes don't have full control over their land and laws anymore. And the land is the big thing, perhaps, and these go back to the early 1800s, a couple of Supreme Court cases and a federal statute that's still in the book. But there's three types of land in Indian country today. So trust land. Trust land, basically the federal government owns the underlying title to it, and the tribe or individual Indian has use rights to the land. There's also restricted fee land. So restricted fee means somebody, the tribe or the individual Indian owns the fee simple title, but the federal government has placed restrictions on its use. Then there's plain old fee simple land that also exists in Indian country. Fee simple is the most common land tenure system in the US. If you own your house, you probably own title and fee. In Indian country, trust land is the most common land tenure system. And using trust land is, to say the least, quite complicated. So if you want to get a lease on trust land, you can't just go lease it on your own. The federal government has to approve the lease agreement. In fact, if you want to get a mortgage, the Secretary of the Interior has to sign off on your home loan. And you can imagine Doug Burgum's not going to stop his day to sign on your loan. So that's one of the reasons home ownership is so low on the res. And even once you negotiate the price, you and the potential buyer, the federal government can come in and veto it. Nope, we don't think that's a fair price, or we don't think the length of payment terms are good. So everything you do can just be rescinded by some federal bureaucrat who probably doesn't have any leasing experience. And apart from that, there's all sorts of environmental and historical reports you have to do to complete a lease. And one of the best known one is the NEPA. It exists outside of Indian country too. However, on the Bureau of Indian Affairs website, it actually says, outside of Indian country, you're probably going to get a waiver. In Indian country, not a chance. And according to the Government Accountability Office, the lowest thing you're going to have to do under NEPA is an environmental assessment. And on the low case, that's going to take about 6 months and cost $300,000. That's 6 months and $300,000 you can skip by operating outside of Indian country. And if you're really unlucky, you'll get a full environmental impact study. And that, according to the Government Accountability Office, costs on average $6.6 million and takes 4.6 years to complete. So why would you invest in Indian country when you got to pay that, when you can just operate off the res and avoid that? But trust land is only one of the problems. There are numerous other land issues too. So just the most basic question, what the heck is Indian country? It's defined by statute 18 U.S.C. 1151 as all land within the boundaries of a reservation. One of the things that's not always clear is, does a reservation exist? The most high-profile example of that was 2020 Supreme Court decision in McGirt v. Oklahoma. So basically, since 1900, most people assume that the reservations had been wiped out in Oklahoma. But in the 2020 Supreme Court said, nope, they still exist because Congress never said, they expressly said they do not exist. So as of 2020, 43% of Oklahoma is Indian country. So what rules apply? In Indian country and state land vary significantly, so there's lots of uncertainty. And then there's checkerboarding. So in the 1880s, the federal government decided it wanted to assimilate Indians and break up reservations through the process known as allotment. So basically, each Indian got 160 acres and it was placed in trust. Some of those phased out, some of those didn't. And that resulted in a pattern, like literally think of a checkerboard. Red squares are tribal land, black squares are state land. And different rules apply in each spot. So it creates tremendous uncertainty for development. In fact, so you can have different zoning rules on the trust land right here and different zoning rules on the fee land right here because different governments are zoning it. So it's incredibly inefficient. And then there's fractionation pursuant to allotment. So what the federal government did, so just hypothetically, it's easier with 100 acres. So a person gets 100 acres placed in trust. And when they pass, they have 2 kids. So you could either do it, each kid gets 50 acres, or each kid gets 100 or 50% interest in the full 100 acres. What the federal government did is you get a 50% interest in the full 100 acres. So over generations, that goes on and on. So now you have, in some cases, over 1,000 people that have an ownership interest in a single piece of land. And to use that land, you have to get a majority of the interest holders to sign off. Good luck. You know, try tracking down 500 people and having them sign off on your project. And that's even trickier because the federal government often doesn't know who owns what by their own admission. There's been multiple lawsuits over that. So it's basically essentially functionalist land. The federal government actually pays more to manage the land than the land is worth. So it's just a completely broken system. Then a further complication is the Supreme Court's decision in Kacheri v. Salazar. So that case took place in Rhode Island in 2009. And basically what the Supreme Court said is if the tribe obtained federal recognition after 1934, it cannot have land placed in trust. And trust land is essential for many things, most famously casinos. So if you want to have a casino, according to the Supreme Court, you had to be recognized before 1934. But the executive and Congress have taken different positions on that. So now if you're recognized after 1934 and you have a casino, your interest rate just went up significantly because the risk of you owning the casino, it's not clear that it's legal now because the land has to be in trust, and the Supreme Court said you can't have trust land. So lots of uncertainty. Then there's also unclear, the Secretary of the Interior has to sign off on anything that encumbers trust land for 7 or more years. Nobody knows what the hell encumbering trust land means. Does that mean putting up a gas station? Is a camper encumbering it? Nobody knows. And then a 1790 Trade Intercourse Law Act is still in the books. And that law said tribes cannot sell their land to anybody but the federal government. So this means if, say, the Eastern Band of Cherokee buy land in Philadelphia, they beat you in an auction for it, and they want to sell it, they can't do that unless Congress actually passes a law saying they can sell the land. So there's about a dozen tribes that Congress has actually passed a law saying Coushatta tribe of Louisiana can sell land it buys on the private real estate market. So literally an act of Congress for tribes to participate in the private real estate market. And then Indian trader laws, there's lots of bureaucracy, but these are my favorite Indian trader laws because they're so stupid. They're literally from 1790, they're still in the books. 25 USC 261 and 264, they're overtly racist. They say white people can't work for tribes without federal permission. Like, yeah, doesn't make any sense to still be on the books, but they are. And they were put into place because the federal government assumed that Indians were too incompetent to trade with white people. That was the express purpose. And they're still on the books. So if you're a non-Indian seeking to trade with tribes, you have to prove you have good moral character, have good business experience, and all that stuff. And so say you start the business and you want to sell it to somebody, they have to go get their own license. It's a very screwy system. And it's not often enforced, but violation results in the forfeiture of all your goods. And pursuant to the Indian trader laws, the federal government actually has the ability to go in and set the prices at your store. And to be sure, they're not often enforced. But let's say the feds come in and decide to enforce it. What's your defense? I know it was there, but I didn't think you were going to enforce it. I mean, is that a good defense? Probably not. So it jacks up the cost of doing business in Indian country by creating significant uncertainty. And then the federal government has complicated basic things like contract enforcement and tort law too. So let's say going back to the airport, I get into a crash. You know, where am I going to file a lawsuit? In Pennsylvania, because that's where the crash occurred. It's not so simple in Indian country. The presumption is tribes do not have jurisdiction over non-Indians, unless the non-Indian does one of two things known as the Montana exceptions. One, the non-Indian can consent to tribal court jurisdiction, so you sign a contract or something with a tribe or a tribal member, then you could subject yourself to tribal jurisdiction. And alternatively, the Supreme Court has said tribes have jurisdiction over non-Indians engaged in behavior that jeopardizes tribal welfare. That seems like a very broad exception, but nobody knows how they apply. In fact, the Supreme Court's never flatly upheld tribal jurisdiction over non-Indian, at least since 1900. It's interesting that this only came into place in 1978, these jurisdictional restrictions, but that's a topic for another day. But so when you don't know who enforces the law, that obviously creates a lot of uncertainty. So do you file the lawsuit in state court, federal court, or tribal court? There was one case that settled 3 years ago. There were 26 separate proceedings in tribal, state, and federal court just figuring out where to file the lawsuit, not even who was wrong. So this creates lots of uncertainty, and you can just avoid this by not doing business on the res. And one of the things that's particularly complicated is in most contracts, you have what's known as a forum selection clause. To avoid jurisdictional things, you just sign, you know, I agree to litigate this case if anything happens in Pennsylvania, and we're done. Doesn't matter if you were tricked, didn't read it, whatever. The contract says that, you're done. In Indian countries, Supreme Court's not so clear whether these are enforceable. So you're going to fight over whether your consent to tribal jurisdiction is actually sufficient to consent to tribal jurisdiction, which is really screwy because consent is the rule. But the Supreme Court actually split 4-4 on that in 2016. So we don't know. And what makes it worse is you can't just challenge tribal jurisdiction in federal court. Before you can do that, the Supreme Court has said you have to exhaust your tribal remedies. So this means you're going to have to file the case in tribal court. It's probably going to take you a year or two to get the trial court judgment. Then most tribes have a court of appeals or Supreme Court. And that's going to take another year or two to get a judgment on that. So you're going to spend 4 years in tribal court on legal fees and just time waiting before you can even go challenge tribal jurisdiction in federal court. So you're lacking up legal fees for nothing, just trying to figure out where to file the case, not to resolve the dispute. Most people don't want to deal with that. And even if you get a valid judgment in tribal court, state courts are not bound to honor the tribal court judgment. Likewise, if you had a valid judgment in state court, tribes do not have to follow the state court judgment because tribes exist independently of the U.S. Constitution. They're separate sovereigns, so they're not bound by the full faith and credit clause. Likewise, states don't have to recognize tribal judgments. In some states, tribes in the states have worked out agreements where they're going to honor each other's judgments. That can also be tri-specific, so there's lots of uncertainty. Even if you win, it's not clear you can collect on your judgment. And then the tax rules. This is probably one of the biggest misconceptions. Everybody thinks Indians don't pay taxes. That is what it says in the Constitution, but we've been ignoring that for a long time. But again, that's another topic. So the tribe itself is tax exempt, like all governments are tax exempt. You know, Pennsylvania doesn't pay state taxes. So if you're a Hopi on the Hopi reservation, you do not pay taxes. So Arizona Hopi reservation is within Arizona. So Arizona cannot tax a Hopi on the Hopi reservation. And the tribes also have the inherent sovereign right to tax because they're governments. But let's say you're a Chickasaw and go on the Hopi reservation. Now the state of Arizona can tax you, and the tribe can also tax you. So if you're doing business in Indian country, you can actually be taxed by both the tribe and the state. So you are double taxed. And who wants to be taxed twice when you can just stay off the res and only be taxed by the state? So that's a big disincentive to do business in Indian country. And the Supreme Court has set forth a test whereby tribes can, quote, preempt state taxation, but it's very vague, by the Supreme Court's on a mission here. It's a particularized inquiry. So precedent is not particularly useful because facts are often slightly different. And in reality, tribes always lose. There was a case in Washington in 2018. The tribe put up all the money to build a shopping center on its reservation. It provides all the governmental services, and the federal government supported the project. The state provides zero services, but it collects $40 million a year in taxes from the tribal business. The tribe gets zero. Federal court said that's cool because of particularized inquiry. So that creates complications for business in Indian country, obviously, because if you don't have taxes, how do you fund courts, roads, police, and things like that? So without that infrastructure, doing business is obviously a little bit trickier. And then tribal law. So the federal government's caused lots of problems in Indian country, and I could keep going, but we're short on time. But tribes haven't done themselves any favors either. Most tribes haven't updated their business laws. In fact, it's really hard to find the laws of many tribes. And if they do exist, they're not always well developed. And even if they do have the laws, the bureaucracy is not always that great. There's limited funds tribes have. And, are often in remote areas, so it's really difficult to attract people to work on reservations. And again, there's not much housing on the res, so where are you going to live even if you want to work there? So it's really tricky. And tribes often have what's known as a tribal employment rights ordinance. This means if a business is going to operate on the reservation, it's got to check in and try to find jobs for the tribal citizens too, which is great because you're trying to create opportunities for tribal citizens. But the flip side is, if you're a business, do you want the tribe telling you who to hire? So it's a catch-22. And then tribes also have sovereign immunity. So this means, you're doing business with the tribe and you're unaware and something goes wrong. You want to sue the tribe. So they're like, whoops, I've got sovereign immunity. Too bad, so sad. So that's a big disincentive too. So again, the federal government has caused lots of problems, but tribes haven't always done everything they can to attract business from a legal standpoint. And that's what I'm hoping to change with the Indian Country Private Sector Project grant that the Templeton Foundation has generously provided. So the goal of it is twofold. One is to raise awareness of the obstacles to doing business in Indian country. And the other is basically to help tribes put in motion the legal reforms that are needed to do business. We're not making anybody do anything. If you don't want to update your laws, that's totally cool. But if you talk to most tribes, I would bet all of them are going to say they would like to have more opportunities for small businesses and entrepreneurs. And what we're saying is this is some of the things you need to consider if you want to make that happen. So our annual conference, we call it the All Roads Lead to Chaco Canyon Conference. A buddy of mine, Joe Austin, and I, who's actually the lead for the sub-grantee on this project, we started this while we were in law school. And we chose Chaco Canyon because we were in Arizona, and that's a big pre-contact site, Chaco Canyon, not too far away. And again, Chaco Canyon shows that doing business is completely consistent with Indigenous culture. There's often that stereotype in tribal communities, that's not part of our culture, but that's complete nonsense. People weren't walking from South America to Chaco Canyon for the scenery. They were doing it because they wanted the stuff available at Chaco Canyon. So commerce is completely consistent with Indigenous culture is a big part of this conference. And we try to connect non-Indian businesses with tribal communities too to help break down some of those barriers. Then we're going to do a couple trainings each year. One of them we're calling Reservation Economics. We did that in February at the Tunica Biloxi Reservation. And basically the goal of the training is to show the nexus between legal institutions and development. Basically an Econ 101 focused on Indian country issues. Then we're going to do our first tribal commercial law training in June at the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona. And tribal commercial law is going to be a little bit different. We're going to focus specifically on code reform and courts and how they focus and impact things like accessing capital, and try to highlight those points to tribal leaders. Then tribal business forums are another thing. So that was one of the things when I was working on this grant. What is something that nobody's done in the past to try to spark tribal economies? There have been various trainings for tribal leaders, but nobody's ever tried to get business leaders, private investors in a room with tribal leaders and have a conversation. We actually did that at Tunica Biloxi, and it went even better than I had hoped. The businesses, it's not ill will about doing business on the res. They just straight up said, we have no idea what to do. We don't even know who to call if we want to do business. So it was very constructive on that board. Same thing on the tribal perspective. They're just not sure where to start oftentimes to get the word out and break down these barriers. So hopefully something will come from the forums that can lead to some fruitful relationships. Then we also have funding to do research. There is some research on tribal economic development, and it's growing, but it's definitely behind other fields of Indian law and just Indian policy in general. So with the research roundtables, we're going to try to produce at least 10 papers a year focused on how law and development relate to tribal economies. And our first one's going to be with another Templeton Foundation grantee, the Center for Governance and Markets, May 19th and 20th. So we're looking forward to that. And then just to raise more awareness of the issues affecting tribal economies, one of the things we're going to do starting late next year, I guess late this year now, time flies, is a podcast focused on, tribal economies, just some general messaging out. One thing is sure, tribal economies are rough, but it's not because of tribal culture. It's because they have all these bad institutions. Tribes once had, very impressive economies, but the institutional foundations have been broken down. And then we're going to start doing a survey on tribal economies too. We're going to focus on tribal leaders and also on non-Indians too, to see what their perceptions are of tribal economies. And, like if you wanted to do business on a reservation, what are the obstacles? And then we're going to try to start a social media campaign in the near future too. Just general information about tribal economies. Nobody's tweeting about that, including me, because I'm scared of Twitter, but that's a whole nother thing. But anyway, so that's the basics of the grant, and that's going to conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have.